Today, you're going to take a crash course into the brand new Angular 7. Oh, and hey, I'd like to point out this video's awesome sponsor, Skillshare.com, which offers thousands of classes in design, coding, business, and more. For instance, you're about to watch my Angular course, but if you're new to JavaScript, you might want to watch this JavaScript beginner's course at Skillshare. Now, Skillshare is just $10 a month, but if you're the first 200 students to use my very exclusive link below in the description here on YouTube, then you get the first 2 months free. All right, so let's get started. Hey everyone, Gary Simon of Coursetro. So as always, whenever there's a brand new release of Angular, I do a crash course on it. And Angular 7 just released, I think 24 hours ago, and I decided to really whip this up really quickly, and it's about 50 minutes long, and you're going to learn a lot, and I'm going to make the assumption that you've never touched Angular before, all right? So let me just show you and switch over to the browser real quick, and I'll show you the project that we're going to learn how to build. So this right here is pulling from a public test API, so you're gonna learn how to use the HTTP client library to make requests within Angular. You're also going to learn about basic templating. You're going to learn about routing as well. As we can see, routing works, and also how to utilize forms. All right, so if I hit submit, we can see we have validation that is working, and what's really cool, we can type all this in and we're able to access all of this information very quickly. All right, so for today's question, which front-end framework or library do you prefer the most? React, Angular, or Vue? Let me know in the comments. I'll let you know in the first pinned comment for my answer to that question. Also, make sure you check out the sponsor as well as my Patreon account. Make sure to subscribe. I'll shut up now. Let's get started. All right, so let's cover installation. Obviously, the first thing we want to concern ourselves with. And so if you're going to install, get started up with Angular with the Angular CLI or the command line interface, which is the preferable way to go. It makes it very easy, very less or minimal setup work involved in that. Then you're going to need Node.js, which is includes the Node Package Manager or NPM, which will allow you to install the Angular CLI. So if you don't have Node.js, you want to make sure that you go to nodejs.org and just go to downloads and then download it for your operating system, reload your command line or console, and then you will be ready to rock this next command. So that is npm install, or I for short, -G for global, so you only have to do this once, and it's accessible from anywhere in your system. And then the name, which is Angular @Angular CLI. Hit enter and let that install. I just installed it before starting this recording, so I'm all up to date. All right, so if you just type in after it installs ng, we'll see it gives us a list of commands. You can also run ng and then the name of the command, and then -help as it mentions right here for additional flags that you can pass through. All right, so now with it installed, we're going to go ahead and hop into wherever you store your code projects and type in ng and the new command, that means a new project, and then the name of the project. So I'm going to call this ng7 for Angular 7. Now once we do this, it's going to ask us, would you like to add Angular routing? All right, so Y or yes. So I'm going to say yes because I want to have multiple pages and components that we can navigate to. And also, which style sheet format would you like to use? And you can use your arrow keys. If you just want straight up CSS, that's fine. We'll use Sass, which is SCSS here, and then hit enter, and then I'll go ahead and pause until this is finished. Okay, great. It is now finished, and what we can do now is cd into that new folder. ng7 is the name, so we're going to cd into that. And then what we're going to run is ng-serve. And before doing this, though, I want to open up my code editor, which is Visual Studio Code. It's from Microsoft. It's free, very popular code editor. And the way I can open up that is if you have it installed, you can just type in code period in the current folder, and it will open that up automatically in that folder that's ready to go. All right, so then after running that, we're going to run ng-serve and then -o, which is a flag for open. It will open your default browser at HTTP localhost 4200. So this won't take too long, so I'm not going to pause here. But basically, it's compiling the project that it installed by default when we ran the ng new command. And then it's going to open up a browser. It's opening up off screen for me. And this is the typical kind of ugly Angular landing page that we've come to know for, I think, since Angular version 4 or 2. All right, so with this ran, you can hit Control, Shift, and I. You can see there's going to be no errors. Everything's ready to go right here. All right, so let's talk about one of the most basic concepts of Angular. And again, this isn't specific to just Angular 7. This is pretty much since Angular 2 plus, and that is components. All right, so the most basic building blocks of your Angular 7 app are going to be components, and a component consists of 3 primary elements, and that is the HTML templating, also the logic or the code associated with it to make it dynamic and interactive, and then also the styling, which is like the CSS or the Sass if you chose a preprocessor like that. So let's go ahead and go to our code editor real quick. All right, so I'm going to hit Control Plus just to make this a little bit larger so that we can see everything that's happening. And let's take a look first at the project setup in the folders. You're going to spend all your time pretty much in your source folder right here. All right, so we have assets that can go in here. We're not going to touch this for this course. And then we're going to work a lot in the app folder. This is where all your components go, as well as your services and stuff like that. As you can see, we have an index.html right here. And we can see that we have an app root. And basically, everything that's coming from this app component.ts file, you see the selector, app root shows here. So this is our main component right here. And so you can also see the structure that I mentioned before. I'm going to hit Control B to get rid of that sidebar momentarily. So we can see the way these a component is structured is that we have our imports up at the top, and then we have what's called a component decorator. All right, so the component decorator has it's an object that has a bunch of configuration settings for this particular component. All right, so we have a selector, which is just a unique name that you can reference the component in different areas of your app. We have a template URL, which specifies the actual HTML or the templating section. You can also do inline HTML within this component by changing up this property. I forget what the exact name of that is. It might be just be template, and then you can just write in with backticks multi-line HTML if you want to. But I prefer to keep everything kind of structured into different files. And then also style URLs for the Sass or the CSS file that you have here. And then finally down here, we have your component logic, as I mentioned. So we have those 3 things. You have your HTML, your CSS, and then you have your logic right here. All right. So basically, we're going to be using several different components for our app. Before we get to that part, though, I do just want to mention, looking at this structure, your components will consist of 4 different files, especially when you generate them with the Angular command line interface tool. The one that this one generated is just a single component called app. So it's app.component dot, and then we have a .html. So all of this HTML right here is in reference to this stuff right here. We also have a Sass, and this is where any of the specific CSS or the rule sets that are associated or defined in this HTML template will go here. We do also, by the way, have a global CSS file over here called styles.css. So your page background and anything that's kind of universal across multiple components can go here. And we'll be working in that momentarily. And then we have a spec file. This is for testing. And then our main component logic file right here. All right, so now let's go ahead and generate 4 different components that we're going to use for the creation of our fictional app. All right, so we're going to go, you could just go, I think what we'll do instead of just going back to this separate console, we'll go to View here, and then we'll go to Terminal. All right, and then I'm going to type in here, ng, and then generate component. Sorry, I'm choking a little bit. And then the name of the component. All right, so in our case, we're going to generate a component called nav. That'll be kind of like our header. And you'll see when you run this, it gives you an output. It created these 4 files right here, like I mentioned before, and it also puts them in a new folder based on the name that you gave the component. So you can see those files right here. And it also updated our app module TS file right here. And all it does is it imports, it adds this line right here, and then it adds it as a declaration, okay? Now, typically, if you wanted to create your own component from scratch, you would have to do this part manually to make sure that it works. All right, so let's go ahead and I'm going to hit the up arrow key and then just change nav to, oh, well, we'll do the shorthand syntax just so I can show you. If you want to save yourself a little bit of time, ng, G for generate, C for component, and then the name. So we'll create another one called about, for a quick about page, for instance. And then we'll also do it again and create another one for contact. All right, and then we'll do another one for home. All right, so now we can see 4 folders right here that are ready to go. All right, so now let's talk a little bit about templating. All right, so as you know, the templating occurs in our HTML files. So you may have noticed that one of the components that we generate was called nav, which is right here. So the first step is to visit, if we want to get our nav in here, inside of our main component that's displaying in this section, we have to go ahead to our app component HTML. And then we're going to get rid of everything with exception to this router outlet. The router outlet is where other components will automatically load based on the route that we're currently at. You'll see how it works if that's confusing to you in a second. So what we're going to do is we're going to put in a custom HTML element based on the name or the selector property of the nav component. So the property name of that selector happens to be app-nav. All right, so we're going to save that. We're also going to wrap this in section. And so let me show you real momentarily. And by the way, this is just an HTML element that's going to allow us to style any content going inside of here. So if I go back to our nav and we go to nav component, or the main component file, we'll see the selector is app nav. So that's where that came from. That's how we can kind of nest components into other components. All right, so let's go ahead back here. And then at this point, let's specify the HTML to make this navigation work. All right, so we're going to go to nav.component.html and get rid of that sidebar. I'm going to make this just a little bit larger here. And everything, I'm just going to paste this from the written version of this tutorial, just because nothing too advanced is happening here. All we have here is a header. And then inside here we have a container, and this is going to allow us to kind of just at about 80% shrink the main layout from the browser edge. And then we have a logo with an A element. The one thing that's going to be a little bit strange if you're new to Angular is this attribute right here, which is specific to Angular 7. And well, not just Angular 7, but this has been around for a long time, and that is router link. So instead of using href to try to navigate to your different components, you have to use router link. All right, so this goes to the home page, and we can see this says app title here. Then also we have a nav element, unordered list, list items, and then we have home, about, and contact using router link. All right, so let's save that. All right, and one thing that I wanted to also talk about while we're talking about templating is interpolation. How do you actually show properties that are defined in the component logic and send it off to be viewed or printed out in the component template? Well, let's say, for instance, we wanted to change this. Let's go ahead and first, let me save this. We can see now all the other stuff has been gotten rid of because we deleted it. And now we have just the raw, ugly HTML from the nav that's being put in or nested in the main app component. So let's say, for instance, we wanted to make this dynamic for some reason, and we want to define whatever this value is in the component, the nav component.ts file. Well, first we do this through interpolation, and that basically means just printing out data. And you do this by wrapping a property name that's defined in the component logic within these double curly braces right here. So the name of the property we'll say is app title. We'll save it. It's not going to show anything because it's not yet defined. So if we Control B, we go back to our file right here, nav component TS file. We'll go ahead and specify the app title property just inside of our class. So app title. And if you want to do this the TypeScript way, we put a colon, and the type of property this is going to be is a string, and we bind it to a string, and we'll just say my app. All right, so if we save it, when we go back, we'll see it says my app right there. Now you could also do it just a straight up JavaScript way. For instance, if you just wanted to do app title equals my app, that will work. Why, I can't type, geez. That will work as well. All right, so we'll just stick, because this is using TypeScript, we'll just stick to the TypeScript way for now. All right, so let's go ahead and make that not look like absolute garbage and make it look like a nice header, horizontal nav bar at the top. So that means we're going to start focusing a little bit on the CSS. I'm not going to be sitting here typing out a bunch of CSS. I'll be pasting it from the written version of this tutorial. Again, that's in the description that you can get. So the first thing we'll do, instead of going to this Sass file specific to here, I want to define some of the global CSS rule sets first. All right, so I'm going to copy from the written version of this tutorial and paste right here just some very basic rule sets. We're just setting some, the body and HTML elements, text decoration none, our container that we referenced, the container class. Nothing crazy has happened. We're using display grid just to structure that top nav area from the logo in the navigation stuff like that, as well as the section element. All right, so let's save that, and then we're going to go back. And by the way, we'll see that some stuff has changed. Obviously, we need to work a little bit more on making that actually work. So let's go back to our nav component SCSS file. All right, so in there, once again, I'm going to paste in just some rule sets based on Sass. Very simple stuff, nothing crazy happening here. So if we save this, and let me just get this back out to 100%. There we go, our simple app. So currently, none of these work. Even though we have the router link pointing to a direction, we haven't done the setup work to get the routing actually working. So let's talk about that. So now that we have our navigation, let's go ahead and open up the app routing file. So when we started this project with the Angular command line interface, it asked us after we entered or issued the ng new command, it asked us if we wanted to have the router added to this project. And because we said yes, it adds this file right here, app-routing.module.ts. And inside of this routes array right here is where you define your individual routes, and it's an array of objects. All right, so we're going to put in an object here. We're going to put in a path property, so this is in reference to where they're at in the browser location. And then I'm going to make this one just the home route. So we're going to say component, and then it's going to be set to home component. And in order for that to work, we have to first import the home component. So import home component from, and then we do home.component. All right, so then we have two other routes that we want to do. So I'm going to simply just paste those in from the written version because you understand what's happening now. So we have our about component, about, contact, about, and contact here. And then we'll go ahead also and paste in the other two objects for those respective routes right here. And this is what that looks like. So we have our path of about, and that's set to the about component, and then contact is set to the contact component. So there are also some other properties that you can issue with this based on your needs. One of the most common use cases would be if you wanted to have URL parameters in here, and you usually do that by designating a colon and then the name of the URL parameter that you want. In our case, we don't need that, but you can always look that up in the official docs or other tutorials. All right, so now if you save this, we'll go ahead back to our browser, and we should see right away home works. There we go. If we go to about works, contact works, awesome, it's ready to go. And so the reason it says home works, of course, is because when you use the CLI to generate these components, you'll see that like not nav, but home rather, we'll see it's just they're simple paragraphs with the name of the component that you issued with works at the end. All right. Now, in the next several sections, we're going to be using our home component rather, sort of as a testing/playground section to where I can show you some specific features to Angular 7 that you're eventually going to want to learn to know. These are common concepts for Angular and Angular 7. So one of the most used forms of event binding is a click event. So you often need to make your app respond when a user clicks on like a button, for instance. So how do you do that? Well, let's go ahead and visit our home component TS file. All right, and instead of the home TS file, sorry, we have our we need to go to the HTML file. There we go, the template. We'll get rid of that, and we're just going to put an H1 element called home. No, not ho. And then we're going to put a button element, and then the way we get event binding working is we wrap the name of the particular event. In our case, this is going to be a click-based event with parentheses, and we bind it to a method, and we'll call this one first click. All right, and then we'll give it a value of click me. All right, so we'll save that, and then we're going to go back to our home component TypeScript file where our logic will reside. So now we create that method that we referenced on the click event called first click, and we'll just console log clicked. All right, so make sure that both of those files have been saved, and we hit Control-Shift-I. We have our console up here. We'll click it. There we go. Very exciting stuff. It worked. All right, so there are a lot of other different types of click events. So from the written tutorial, I've put those right here. So you can do focus on blur, on scroll, cut, copy, paste, key up, down, mouse enter, a lot of different things that you can do to communicate based on these events to the component logic. Now let's also talk about Angular's class and style binding. So sometimes you may need to change the appearance of your UI from your component logic or based on some user interactivity of sorts. So there's two ways to do this. You could do it through class binding or style binding. All right, so there are a lot of different methods you can use to control class binding. I'm not going to cover all of them, but I will cover the two most common use cases for this. So let's say that you want to control whether or not a CSS class is applied to a given element. We'll say we're going to update this H1 element right here in our home component template file to this. So we wrap this time, instead of parentheses, we're going to be doing brackets, and this is based on attribute binding. Class dot, let's say there's a class called gray in our SAS file, and we want to show it based on whether or not a given property that's bound right here is true or false. All right, so we're just going to call this H1 style. All right, so gray is only going to be attached to this H1 class if H1 style, a Boolean property, equals true. All right, so let's save that, and let's go back to our home component file right here, and we're going to set this up right here, H1 style. It's of type Boolean, and then equals false by default. So when the page loads, it's not going to attach that gray class to it. All right, so when somebody clicks on that button, let's remove this line. Let's say this.h1style equals true. And then finally, let's go ahead and define in this component's Sass file that gray class just like this. So we're only going to change the color to gray. So save all of that, and we'll go back here and we'll click it. There we go. Of course, it doesn't toggle, although you could integrate that functionality if you wanted to. All right, so let's say, what if you wanted to control multiple classes on a given element? Well, we use ng class instead, and it's set up slightly different, but it's very easy to use nonetheless. So what we'll do is change this up so that this is ng class equals, and then we put in an object here, and then inside of here, each line will represent a different CSS property, all right? So, or CSS class rather. So the gray class will say is only going to show for if h1 style is true. I'm going to hit Shift Alt and the down arrow key here to duplicate that. And we'll have a second class that we haven't yet defined called large. And this will only show up if h1 style is not true or if it's false. All right, so now let's go back real quickly and we'll add our large class right here. So when we go to this, it should be real large by default because when it loads up, we have that property set to false. Okay, and there we go. So now if I click this, it obviously removes the large class and adds the gray class. All right, so now what about changing the style? All right, so instead of relying on a separate CSS or Sass file for classes, you can actually change inline CSS through the styles. So let's show you real quickly how you do that. So now what we'll have is we'll change this up here to style dot and then the CSS property. So we'll say color, which is a CSS property, and we'll bind it to, real quickly, we'll say h1 style. If h1 style is true, which is the question mark here, then we will say it's gray. And then otherwise, if not, it will be black. And as we can see, if we click it, it works just the same. Now we can also, like there is an ng class, there's also an ng style for controlling multiple CSS properties in much the same way. So we just simply put in ng style, and then we'll take this out, and we'll put in, oh, stop it, there we go, another object here. And then this time it is, each line will represent a different CSS property. So we'll say h1 style, and it will be gray. If not, then black. And then this one will be size. And we'll say if it doesn't exist, then it will be 1em, otherwise 4em in terms of size. All right, so we'll save that. Oh yeah, and that's right, and that's because I needed to change font size. That's the correct CSS property. That was a brain fart there. So now we click it, and there we go. Awesome, awesome stuff. So now let's switch topics here and talk about Angular 7 services. All right, so services in Angular 7 allow you to define code that needs to be accessible across multiple components in a central location, essentially. All right, so the way we generate a service file is we're going to come to, let me hit Control B here. We're going to view our terminal, and we use our generate command. So it's going to be ng g for generate, s for service, and the name. We'll call this data. All right, so then we're going to open up, and it tells you exactly what it created and where it created. We're going to open this up, and right here, we're going to go to our data service TS file. And it looks very much like a typical component with your imports, a decorator in your class here, except this is an injectable decorator instead of a component decorator. All right, and so now let's create a method just to give this a quick test here. So we'll just name this first click again, and we're going to return console log clicked. So we'll save that, and then to use this in any of our components, we'll visit the component that we want to access this particular service from. And so in our case, it will be our home TypeScript file. We're going to import the data service from the location of the file right there in that line. All right, and then we're going to, in order to gain access to it, we do what's called creating an instance of it through dependency injection in the constructor. Now, if that sounds scary and you never heard of it before, don't worry, it's not really. We're just going to say private data, and then it's bound to data service. So now whenever we want to access methods and such from our data service, we just reference this.data and then the name of the method. All right, so in this case, our first click method that's defined here, I probably shouldn't have used the same name, but nonetheless, this.data, and we'll see it's showing up automatically for us here, first click, just like that. All right, so now we're console logging it in the data service, and we'll know it will work, or will have worked if we look at the console when we click this. All right, and there we go. We can see that it works. And now you understand a pattern where you can define properties and methods inside of a central location that you can now access from multiple different components, all right, which is very handy. So one of the obvious use cases for this is if you're trying to communicate with a backend of some sort and you're trying to send or retrieve data maybe from like a REST API. So Angular comes with its own HTTP library that we will use to communicate with a fake API service to grab some data and then display it in the home template. All right, so this will take place within that data service that we already generated with the CLI. Now, in order to gain access to this HTTP client library, we have to first visit our app module TS file up here, right there. It's in the source folder. And then up here, just underneath here, it doesn't really matter where you put it, we're going to import the HTTP client module from right here, which is Angular Common HTTP. And then we add it to the imports array, this right here. And that's all you have to do. You only have to do this once whenever you need to use the HTTP client module. All right, and then we're going to visit our app data.service file that we created. All right, so if we want to use and gain access to the HTTP client, we have to import it up here. So it's the HTTP client this time from Angular Common HTTP. And then also we're going to, once again, through dependency injection, create an instance of it, private. We'll call this HTTP client. All right, so now we'll get rid of this return. We're also going to rename this. We'll say get users. We're going to return this.http, and we're going to get, and then we're going to, I'm going to hit up just a kind of a fake API testing service called reqres.in. You can go to that URL, by the way, and they give you a bunch of different endpoints that you can use for testing. All right, and so that's all our data service is right now. You could, obviously, if you had different endpoints, you would define them in the form of different methods in this file. So now we'll go back to our home component TS file. We can see this is now breaking, and we're going to make a few changes. So we're going to store, let's delete that, the returned data as an object, and we're going to call it users, and it's just going to be an object here. This first click thing we can now get rid of. And ng on init, so we haven't really discussed what this is. This is an Angular lifecycle hook. So basically whatever happens here will get executed when this component loads up. So that's what we would want to do by default when we visit the home page. We want all the users to show up automatically. All right, so what we do is this.data, and then we use our get users method that we just created, and then we're going to subscribe to the result. So we'll say the data, and then once we have the data, we're going to bind this .users, which is the object that we defined above, to the data. All right, and also, just real quickly, let's console log this .data, or this .users rather, or you could do it with data as well. It doesn't really matter. All right, so let's go ahead back, and now you can see automatically we're getting that object that's returned from that endpoint. All right, we can see there's data here, and we have a first name, last name, an avatar, all that good stuff. Also pagination and all that. All right, so now let's make this so that we can actually display this right here in our template. So let's go back to our home component HTML template. Let's get rid of all this stuff here. Don't need that anymore. And we don't need the button. And so I'm going to put in a UL element, and we're going to say ng if. So if the users has data in it, then only show this UL element along with the elements inside of it. And then we're going to have a list item here. And oops, there we go. In here, we're going to put ng4, and this allows you to iterate over an array or an array of objects. And so we'll say let user of users, and users is the property that we defined. And we're going to say users.data, because if you recall looking at the console logged information, the stuff that we want is inside of an array called users.data, and it's an array of objects. So then inside of here, we'll have an image just to show the user's avatar. So we're going to use property binding on the source attribute, and we're going to bind that to user.avatar. And then we're going to have just a paragraph element and we're going to use interpolation, user.firstname, and then also we're going to have user.lastname right here. And if we're lucky at all, we'll go ahead and let's see, go here. There we go. And now it looks really bad, so let's go ahead and style this up. All right, so we're going to go into our home component CSS or the Sass file, get rid of these two rule sets, and I'm going to paste this from the written version of the tutorial. Nothing crazy happening here. It's just going to make it look a lot better. And there we go. Awesome, awesome stuff. All right, so now let's talk about Angular 7 forms. All right, so we have our home page, an about page, and we're not even going to mess with this. I don't even know why I included it, but also a contact us page. So let's create a basic form. Now, we're not going to make this actually send an email, but I'm going to show you how to work with forms, and then it would simply be a matter of doing a search on Google to figure out how to actually take that data and then send it off to, maybe an email service of some sort. But doing this, we're going to cover validation, form validation, and displaying the data and actually getting the data from the forms themselves. All right. So when it comes to Angular, you have two approaches when it comes to creating forms. You have the template-based approach, or you have reactive forms, as it's called. All right, so I'm not going to go into the differences too much between these two approaches, but reactive forms generally provides you with more control, and form validation could be unit tested with reactive forms, whereas they cannot be with the template-driven forms. So to get started with reactive forms, we're going to visit our app module TS file once again, and we're going to import the reactive forms module from the Angular forms library right here. All right, and then of course, once again, we'll take reactive forms module and we'll import it to, or add it to our imports array right here. Once again, only has to be done once. And then we're going to visit our contact component. So it's right here. All right, so we're going to import 3 different functions from the Angular forms library. And that is the form builder, the form group, and validators. So you'll see how these will all come into play as we start to add our code here. So first, before we get to structuring the actual forms, we're going to put in 3 different properties. So we're going to create a property called message form, And I'm just going to call this type of form that we're going to do in the contact like a message. So I'm just going to name it message form. And we set this to form group. So this is a new form group, which is something that we imported up here. And you'll see how the form group works in a second. Now we're also going to do dependency injection of our form builder, which is also another function that we imported. So form builder. All right, so in our constructor inside of here, we'll say this dot message form equals this dot form builder. And by the way, you can go to the official docs and they have this covered in great length. And then we say the group method, and we put in an object here, and we're going to put in the actual form fields and their names. So name, so we're going to let a person specify their name, and then we put in an array, and the default value is just going to be empty of the name. And then we say validators, and this is where your validation rules are set, and we'll say dot required. All right, so this option is required. You can also put other different types of validation in here, so I would suggest looking up the official docs for what you can do. You can do stuff like minimum and maximum character lengths, all that stuff. And then also we'll have a text area called message for the actual message, and we're just going to leave this as the same right here as well. And then finally, we're going to create a method down here that's called when somebody submits the form and they click the submit button. So on submit, we'll say this dot submitted equals true. So let's create that up here real quickly. So we're going to say submitted equals false. And then we also have another one we're going to put success equals false as well. You could do that the TypeScript way too. And basically, this is going to help us determine if the form has been submitted. And success will mean if all of these values have been validated and they result to true. So then right here, we're going to say if this dot message form dot invalid. Again, you can look up all these potential methods down here in the official documentation for reactive forms. Then we're simply going to return. We're not going to allow any code after this point to execute. So otherwise, we'll say this dot success equals true. Now in here, in this section, or after this part right here, is where you would ordinarily use or connect to some type of backend to send the data that's submitted in order for, like an Amazon S3, for instance, that will allow you to actually send the email. So let's save that, and then we're done here. So then we'll go ahead into our contact. Let's see, our template file right here. All right, so let's just put in an H1 contact us, and then we'll put in a form. All right, so the action, we don't even need an action. We're going to put in here form group. So we take this particular form, we bind it to the name of the form group, which is message form that we defined in the component logic. And then we're going to say through event binding, instead of click this time, it's going to be ng submit. So on form submission, we're going to call the onSubmit method that we created. Simple enough. All right, then here we're going to put h5, and I'm just going to put in ngIf, and we'll say success. And then inside of here, we'll say your form is valid. So by default, this won't show up when you first visit a contact page. It will only show up once they've submitted it and success equals true. All right, so now let's put in a label here. And I'm not going to have a for attribute. I'm just going to wrap everything in this label. And we're going to say name. And then we're going to have an input. Type is text. And then form control name equals name. So this sets this input value that's defined right here. All right. And then we're going to have our form validation output right here in this section. You can use any type of HTML elements that you want. I'm going to put div and ngIf equals submitted. So if submitted equals true, then and then also message form dot controls dot name dot errors. So this will only show if it has been submitted and if there are errors. All right, let's give this a class of error. And then we're going to have another one of ngIf equals message form dot controls dot name dot errors dot required. All right, so this allows you to specify different messages or different outputs based on which validation failed. We're only using required here, so we're going to say dot required, and we're going to say your name is required, bro. There we go. All right, so that's it for that one. Let's take this, and instead of copying this and making some adjustments, I'm just going to copy this from the written version of the tutorial. All right, we'll see, is that all the same? We have message, except this time instead of an input text field, we have a text area. The form control name is message. And then all I did is just replace message or replace name right here with message as needed. So it's basically exactly the same. After that, let's put in an input. The type is going to be submit. All right, and the value is send message. Class will be CTA for call to action. We'll style that up in a second. All right. And then also at the very bottom, just to output the results, I'm going to put in a div ngIf equals submitted class equals results. And then we'll put in here a strong element of name. And down here we'll have a span element, and we'll use interpolation. And we gain access to the form properties by message form controls name.value. All right, so we'll copy this. Actually, I'll just copy it from the written version over here. And it's the same thing, message, and then message is changed right here. All right, so let's go ahead and save that. And before we check it out in the browser, I'm going to copy the CSS from the written version of the tutorial real quickly, and I'll paste that into this component's CSS file right here. So let's save that and give this a shot. So now if I hit send message, there we go. Your name is required, bro. A message is required. Now what's really cool about this is right when I start typing, that goes away. And it also shows up automatically down here in the value as I type. Type hit send, your form is valid. There we go. Now, one final thing I want to talk about is deployment. All right, so what do you do exactly to get this deployed? Well, we first have to run a command ng build. All right, and this is just going to build everything and package it up into a dist folder, or short for distribution. So now that it's done, we can see that there's a new dist folder right here. So let's right click. I'm going to reveal an explorer. All right, so I'll click on this. We have our ng7 folder, and we can see now that we have our files, and these are a little bit large. So for production builds, what you want to do is run ng build -prod right here, and then hit enter and let it rebuild, and you'll see how much smaller these ultimate files are. So now we can see, based on these file sizes alone, they are much smaller than what we had previously. And we can see right here only 332 KB for the primary file. So if we cd into dist and cd into ng7, we can now run HTTP server, and you have to have this installed through npm, by the way. And we can open this up, and we'll see that the app now loads like it normally would. So what you ultimately would want to do is take the contents of that ng7 folder that we just ran the HTTP server command on and get that uploaded to a web server or web host of some sort. And there's a lot of different deployment tutorials for a lot of different hosting providers as well for Angular specifically. Perhaps I'll cover that in a different tutorial. All right, so hopefully you enjoyed that. It's probably, if you're brand new to Angular, you might be a little bit disoriented, but make sure you just stick with it, create simple projects, and then you can get into more intermediate to advanced topics. For me, it's like second nature now. I love it. So make sure you answer today's question, which is which front-end framework or library do you prefer the most, which is React, Angular, or Vue? Let me know in the comments. And also, if you enjoyed this, make sure you subscribe here. I'm going to be putting out tons of other content and other Angular related content as well in the future. So I will see you later. Goodbye.